Um, Welcome, everyone. Thanks for coming out today. It's my pleasure to introduce our seminar speaker today, Gary Fleener from Hog Island Oyster Company. Hog Island is a very interesting company that started back in the 1980s doing local small-scale oyster farming. And it's just grown to a very large operation that has 200 plus employees. It harvests over 5 million, I hear, oysters and manila clams each year.
A lot.
A lot.
Yeah.
And so Gary did his PhD at the University of Colorado Boulder. He then moved to an academic position at Principia College, where he served as the chair of the Biology and Natural Resources Department, among other roles. But then after that, what is that? What is that face? What did I do wrong?
No, it's good. I'm impressed that you knew those.
Oh, I got you, yeah. After that, he moved from academia into an industry role, which is a pretty unique career path and one that we're going to learn about today. At Hog Island, Gary works at the nexus of science and research and development and sustainability and public outreach. And we're going to learn a bit about how Gary got to this point in his career, the work that he does. And so, yeah, that's it. Thank you very much for coming. And please join me in welcoming Gary back to BML.
Thank you, Sean. And I'm going to do a quick sound check. Everybody good in the back? I usually don't need a mic, but all those 20 people in the Zoom room, hello, welcome. I don't know who you are. But, full disclosure, I'm doing the Ted Grosholz thing. I'm wearing a hat, not because I need one indoors, but just because John Largier and I have been seeing the same barber lately. Yeah. So it's super fun for me to be here, and I'm just going to preamble with a couple of things. I asked my son to put the slide deck for me together, so I have no idea what pictures are going to come up, but it's going to be fun. It'll be interesting. I do hope that I've had a great opportunity to meet with several of you grad students, and I hope that we'll have some good time for questions afterwards. So with that, I'm going to do a little storytelling. A couple of you told me this would be okay. There's no data in my presentation. It is strictly storytelling. Oh, John's walking out. Dude, I'm so sorry. That chapter left me a while ago. So I titled my talk Ivory Towers and Oyster Cages a little bit because Sean and I were talking about the fact that my journey's been a little bit different, and many of you that are students may be at that place where you're deep in the maw of doing graduate school and wondering, what will that look like when I'm done? Will I become an academic, or will I serve in some other way out there in the world? And so when Sean and I were talking, we thought it'd be interesting to unpack my story a little bit, because there may be some either bright lights or precautionary tales that you can heed yourself of. So first off, I want to show you an ivory tower. So I had the opportunity to go to a school that literally was filled with ivory towers. And it wasn't an East Coast Ivy League, is that what you call that? I went to Principia College in Elsa, Illinois. But Principia College was an unusual place in the 1930s. The guy that was running the school was good friends with Bernard Maybeck, who was a very famous Berkeley architect. And Bernard Maybeck wasn't getting many gigs in the Depression. And so the college hired him to come build our campus. And so I went to school in Maybeck buildings. If you guys know Berkeley, you know about Maybeck buildings. And they all looked like English castles. And so I literally did my undergraduate years in ivory towers. So this picture is maybe something that some of you will resonate with. I did not come to graduate school because I was a great math student in high school or a physics student. I came to grad school because after college, I started working in outdoor education, environmental education. And I thought that was great until I started realizing that I probably wasn't going to make it on $35 a day for the rest of my life. And I thought, well, if I went back to school, maybe with a credential, like a master's degree or a PhD, I could make a little more money and maybe still do outdoor education. And that's kind of the truth, actually. I'm not making that up. So I think everybody in this room, who can tell me, besides my piece of paper, what this picture represents? Even though you're mostly younger than me, and a couple of you maybe are the same. We all have this. Everybody with an advanced degree has some memento of that time. This is my field site, right? On the San Miguel River in Colorado. And I spent 4 years working on that river, camped out in a Nature Conservancy trailer, and trying to figure out what the heck I was really supposed to be doing. I don't think you guys have had that feeling before. It's like, I had that imposter syndrome. I was like, I don't think I'm supposed to be here. But I was there, and I learned a lot. So my graduate work was on how fluvial processes author and shape and reshape riparian landscapes in southwestern Colorado. And I was fortunate because the Nature Conservancy owned several big tracts of land in this area, and they kind of wanted to know what is it that really regenerates the riparian system. Now, I have a tip for those of you that might be in your earlier part of your grad career. If you're a little insecure, about how things are going, choose your committee so that the members of your committee are so diverse that they really can't communicate with each other very well. And then bring snacks to the meetings, and you'll find that after a while, they kind of give up on each other and just kind of hurry you on down the line. That's not exactly how it worked, but I ended up with a very diverse committee, which was great for me because I was interested in a lot of things, but not really good at any one thing. I was interested in maps and geographic information systems. I was interested in rivers and mountains, and I was interested in ecology writ large, more at the landscape scale. And my community at the Department of Geography in Boulder kind of allowed me the room to work on all those things. And I'm here to tell you, this was a sobering moment for me. A few nights ago, when I was pulling slides together, telling my son to pull slides together, I looked up my dissertation on Google Scholar, because I never published any parts of it. Some things happened, which I'll talk about. And 1997 was a long time ago for most of you in this room. And my dissertation has been cited 4 times. And one was by my advisor, and the other 2 were by a far more decorated student who came after me a couple of years later. So you never know how that's going to go. I had no idea. I thought thousands of people would have looked at my dissertation. Isn't that how that works for everybody? So this is a fun picture for me. This predates digital cameras. And just as a nod for those, anybody work using any kind of geographic information systems or remote sensing in your work a little bit? So ARC was called ArcInfo, and I used a free software called Idrisi, which was a raster-based software. And we scanned our air photos and then had to orthorectify them by hand. And I framed this picture. It's actually a 3-foot by 3-foot picture. I do still keep it on my wall because I do love that place. I have a lot of good memories about it. So some things happened. Let's just put it that way. Some things happened when I graduated. And who went to a small college undergrad in this group? A couple of you? Yeah. So I don't know, Eric, maybe did you I got the call from my alma mater as I was about to do my, defend my dissertation. We need you back. And so I hired back on at my alma mater in the biology department. And Principia College is not a place that you will find associated with elite scholarship, but it has one of the most robust study abroad programs in the United States. 75% of all the student body studies abroad, and the first study abroad started almost 70 years ago. Great program. I hit the biology department, and the department chair said, you need to start doing abroads. You know, where you want to go? So I said, I want to go to Nepal. She said, have you been to Nepal? Nope. She said, you better go, figure it out. So for my academic career, starting in my second year on faculty as an assistant professor, I started taking students into the landscapes of the Himalayas and eventually the Andes. We got one of those coming up. And that's not really what I want to tell you about this picture. I want to tell you about something that's happening in the foreground that happened to me. As a scientist, I was a fluvial geomorphology guy, right? Looking at riparian ecosystems and that nexus. And I got to tell you, when I got to the Himalayas, I was really miffed that there were all these like buildings and fields in front of my, debris flows and glaciers and stuff. Because when I was taking pictures for teaching, I was there for the mountains. And it probably sounds trivial now, but I had never really considered as a kid from Oklahoma that landscapes all around the world had people producing food in them. And again, now that sounds trivial, but for me, it was the beginning of a pretty profound intellectual shift, right? I thought I was going to be studying rivers and mountains and landslides and stuff like that for the rest of my days, and hopefully doing it in cool places with students. I had 20 students on this trip, and I was 35 years old, and it was crazy. I'm just putting that out there, right? So, let me go back here. So these terraces are quite interesting, and I don't know, they just, entranced me. These people had been living in this landscape for hundreds to thousands of years, depending on where you go in the world, producing food, finding food in these incredible places. And over the next few years, and I did get to go to some other cool places. So anybody know this place? Yes, where? Peru, yeah, called Morai. And it's a fascinating place. These are, if this is a marine research station, this is one of the Inca's agricultural research stations. Best that archaeologists can unpack. They created these terraces from low to high, essentially to experiment with crops and microclimates. Fascinating, right? 500, 600, 700 years ago. So over this next few years, my interest really shifted from the thing that I was trained in to something that became really important to me. And that was thinking about food systems and how people in the world got their food, transformed landscapes into food-producing landscapes. And a little problem because I didn't really have any paperwork that gave me the credentials to do that. And I told some of you at lunch that I ran into some trouble with the dean of faculty at the college because I started teaching a class on ecological agriculture, except it wasn't in the catalog. And I framed it up as a seminar, and she was on me after a while. She's like, you're basically teaching this like a regular class, and it's not in your wheelhouse, it's not in your department. I was like, whoops, But I found that at a small college, it was cool because you can do seminars, and you can kind of do seminars on lots of interesting things. So the point here is that in my academic career, I started thinking I was going to do one thing, and I discovered something deeply important and interesting to me, and pretty soon I found myself drifting into something else, and I think that was okay. Wouldn't be a good slideshow without beer, right? This is non-alcoholic beer, because I'm Gen Z. I'm not Gen Z, but I'm an old guy with a Gen Z kid, right? So it's got to be non-alcoholic beer. So who can tell me what's going on with this picture? You may have been to this place? You know what this story is about? So one of the cool things about field trips, and I've had some of you on field trips out to our farm, and many of you may know, I like field trips. I'm a field trip guy. Nepal, Peru, you know. So in my time at Principia College, while I was getting interested in agriculture, I found out about this place in Kansas called the Land Institute. There's this guy called Wes Jackson. Maybe you've heard of him. He's a pretty famous geneticist. And he was basically taking annual grains backward to perennial grains. And today, if those of you shop Patagonia, the product that they have is called Kernza. Kernza is a perennial wheat that has roots about 15 feet deep, and you cut the wheat heads off the top. And Wes Jackson was he's in his 80s now, but buddies with Wendell Berry. And this trip really, I took some students. You take students, you can do anything, you know, you tell your administrator, taking students. And it's a field trip. So this is a quote that had a big impact on me. I started reading, again, I'm still in my academic post, I'm still supposed to be doing mountains and rivers, but this stuff started to get in my head a little bit. I'm thinking maybe this is important and maybe I want to spend more time with it. And that line that I've italicized, it sounds a little kind of lofty, but I actually think it's something that informs my worldview and the way I think about the work I do now, right up till this time. Is, you know, what happens when we use ecosystems as our metric for successful food producing systems, right? We've been working with that idea in the land space for a really long time, you know, relatively, but not so much in the ocean space, and that's where we're going to end up here in a little bit. So then this happened, right? I'm 10 years into my career, and I get a small human in the equation, and there's a lot of stuff that goes on between those pictures, but we're going to use this as a little segue. This is my son, Sage. He was 5, and we moved out here 14 years ago, and I was driving around. We lived in Sebastopol for 10 years, and I'm looking like we need to learn about our new home, you know, and there's some very complicated reasons. I was tenured and chairing the department. I was the dean of the study abroad office, and just made some choices. We made some choices in our lives and took a parenting sabbatical for a few years. We moved out here, and we're driving down Tomales Bay, Hog Island Oyster Company. Let's check this out. Pull in. No idea. No previous experience there. And when you see your 5-year-old with special needs light up over eating oysters, you're like, maybe oysters are a good thing. But that was really my gateway experience with oysters. And where's my Okie friend? Did she? Oklahoma friend in here? Yeah, there we go. Yeah. So we were discussing earlier that in Oklahoma, oysters come from a different branch of the tree of life. Yes, the Rocky Mountain variety. And I had grown up around those, but I had never encountered these until 14 years ago. So full disclosure, I already made this confession. I'm an imposter in the ocean space. I've been on a learning journey for 14 years. So, of course, you have these things, you eat them, and you don't know much about them, and what happens? You become bivalve curious. That's right. And I became very bivalve curious. There's a wonderful gal in New York City who makes these shirts. I'm happy to connect you if you'd like to get yourself one. So, because some of you may need a shirt like that. And I will tell you, totally off script here, because you can see I have a big script. My son designed a t-shirt that has 6 abalone and says, you know, yeah, Brian remembers this. He met him, and it's like, you know, do my abs make my shirt look big? Yeah. And I really I'm trying to GoFundMe to get that one printed up, you know. So here we go on the next chapter. Now, somebody in here at least knows who this is, right? And so, hey, bivalve curious, I found out about this place called Bodega Marine Labs, and so they had a volunteer coordinator. This was 2011. You guys don't, some of you old timers, you don't even know this, maybe. Yeah, Eric probably does. And I I signed up. I was like, can I volunteer at Bodega Marine Lab? I'm a used up PhD who's trying to learn about the ocean space. And the lady hung up on me. No, she was very nice. And I guess, does it still work this way? That grad students can like get on the list for free humans for labor? Something like that. So I was a free human for labor. And Jill, who was one of Eric's students, was perfect for me because we both had a kind of Colorado connection, and she needed someone to help like grow algae, and she was doing these really cool experiments, challenging native oysters with different climate change variables, right? I mean, that's the simplest way to put it. And she's super nice too. We've been texting the last few days, and I said, "Do you have any pictures?" And she said, "I looked for pictures of us in the lab, but all I found was thousands of pictures of oysters on tiles." And I think that was probably true. She's interestingly teaching at a small college in Virginia, right? George Washington College or something like that. So Jill became my gateway into the Bodega Marine Labs community and my opportunity to start learning about oysters. And I'm referencing this partly because it's fun and partly because it's the beginning of what's turned out to be a really interesting relationship for me with BML without being a faculty member or an academic. And that is that it's okay to retool, right? And to learn new things. And in fact, learning new things may be fairly important as we get later in life for, some other reasons. So I got to hang out with Jill, grow some algae. I met this guy, Joe Newman, who's like the wizard, and with all the pipes everywhere. And I put one of Jill and Eric's papers up there. So Jill was my on-ramping to the beginning of Bivalve Curious. And then I did some other things. Told you I'd put it in there. I volunteered for this and started doing some fish stuff out here, which was kind of fun. I want to go back here, though, and just say that in addition, I started taking myself to conferences, the National Shell Fisheries Association conferences, and just kind of, I wasn't going to go get another degree, but it was kind of like going back to school. And I went through this really cool phase for 4 or 5 years of kind of a personal learning journey of shellfish and ocean farming and research in the marine space. And that, I love that. That is just such awesome fish. And it went back, of course, because it's the CCFR. So how about this Hog Island thing? I told you I ate some oysters there with my kid a lot of years ago now, it feels like. And let me tell you a little bit about the company. Some of you, who knows of the company? Oh, well, that's, there we go. So this will be a quick review, but Hog Island was started 41 years ago. And one of the things I love about it is that the 3 founders, the really 3 that built the company over the first 20 years, were all marine biologists. They weren't business people, they weren't farmers. They were marine bio folks that I think thought growing food in the ocean was a righteous thing to do. I think there were probably surfboards involved and stuff like that. And John Finger, one of those founders, has told me that in the 70s, when he was in college in Long Island, he fell under the sway of that guy, Jacques Cousteau, who back in the 70s was shaping a lot of people's feelings about the ocean. And Cousteau kind of famously said, I'm paraphrasing, at some point, we need to start learning how to farm and ranch in the oceans as a way of contributing food to the global food system. And that was something that stuck with him. So super condensed today. For the first 20 years, they farmed in Tomales Bay. We're going to look at a couple of pictures there. They grew slowly. They had some cool Bay Area accounts, Chez Panisse and Zuni. They were looking for good oysters, I guess. And today we have 5 restaurants, 2 farms, 300 employees, a hatchery, a nursery, and a bald science guy. Does a lot of interesting things, and a lot of other great people. So it's a very, very interesting company. And what attracted me to Hog Island, because I was on my little separate, journey. Thanks, Jill, for getting me started on that. And and somebody asked about this during our lunch. When you work for nonprofits your whole life, whether they're schools or NGOs, my PhD work was funded by the Nature Conservancy. It's an interesting thing. It's lofty. It's big, but we don't live most of our lives in the nonprofit sector, right? We buy stuff, we make choices about the foods we eat and the cars we drive. And I think I was at a place in my career 10 years ago where it's like, I'd kind of like to work for a place that makes the money that funds the good they want to do instead of, knocking doors. And nothing wrong with knocking doors. I was on the board of a high school in Colorado at the time. We were knocking a lot of doors. So Hog Island's very interesting in that way. It's very aspirational. They have high values, but they got their feet. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And every day choices are being made about all kinds of things. That's kind of a big view. Here's the characters. 2 of the 3 still run the company today. Dr. Burge is smiling because she knows these guys. Terry and John Finger, Terry Sawyer. And I really have to say, both of these guys have been great mentors. Terry especially, and here's a little nod, right? These guys don't have PhDs. They get undergraduate degrees, but they have honorary PhDs in the work that they do, right? They've spent close to 50 years now working in the aquaculture space, learning, asking questions. And I think one of the things I've learned over the years is to really honor and acknowledge that real life gives people serious street cred too, and that's okay. Maybe it's okay if you don't finish your degree and you start an oyster farm. So this is the motherland for the company, and I think I can find the little red thing. So there's the kind of Marshall area there. I know many of you in this room have a relationship with this bay and this estuary. This is the Walker Creek estuary, and Tomales Bay, I don't need to tell anybody here, is a very, very interesting place. I learn new things about it every day and probably will continue to for the rest of my time. You can see here's the majority of the aquaculture beds in Tomales Bay are in that alluvial fan formed by the Walker Creek estuary. There's Tom's Point there, and lots of eelgrass out in here, and there's Hog Island right there. So just a little orientation. So I want to spend just a couple of things. Many of you, again, will know this, but this slide for me is great for some storytelling. This is from a Nature Conservancy documentary. It is our boat and our farm out in that area, and it brings up the topic of restorative aquaculture, right? And some of you are familiar with that, many of you maybe. But one of the questions that is of interest to a lot of folks in the aquaculture space, and especially the unfed aquaculture space, is there a way to do this, to grow food that is also regenerative, restorative, nature positive is the new term the Nature Conservancy's kind of latched onto. And that's really interesting to me, right? I'm not here to pound any drums about it, but that's really interesting to me. And I think this is just sort of a great iconic slide for looking at kind of the co-occurrence. We've got oysters, we've got eelgrass, we got, it's all kind of happening there together. And one of the things that I observed early on was that shellfish aquaculture wasn't like, the Midwestern agriculture that I'd grown up with. We organize stuff in rows out there. But when you put shellfish or seaweed out into the ocean on an unfed aquaculture operation, you're kind of inserting it back into an extant ecosystem. You really don't get to go out there and, till it all up and make it neat and uniform and get rid of the competitors. You just kind of put it out there, and for the amount of time that your animals or your algae is out there, it's really participating in the ecosystem in one way, shape, or form. And I like this slide for several reasons. This is a Nature Conservancy slide. Does anybody work directly with the Nature Conservancy? One of the beautiful things about working with the Nature Conservancy, they have a giant budget, and they make beautiful graphics. And then as teachers and educators, we get to use those graphics for years because they're so good. So this is from actually a really interesting meta-study that looked at 65 different sites globally where there were different types of unfed aquaculture. And by unfed, I think you all know we mean they're eating plankton or photosynthesizing. They're not being fed. There's no kibble in this equation anywhere. So, you know, this is just an example of something that stood out to me. In every case, there is no decline in species diversity or species abundance. One of the things that's a little muddied here to me is that the species diversity of a farm site versus an unfarmed control site is not identical, right? There's slightly different things living on a mussel farm. And of course, we can spend a whole time on this, but I love this idea, and it's something that has fed and fostered my interest in this intersection between food systems and ecosystems. So, so my day gig is not this, although I wish this was my day gig, but I have a little science group at the company, and I have a science farm that's embedded inside of the oyster farm, which is kind of cool. We host research. Now, I don't know if anybody currently in this room, but we have hosted several students around here on research projects at our farm. Priya was a recent one. And we do a lot of different things. We challenge oysters against different, you know, we look at how different genetic lineages of oysters perform. You may notice that we have a rather 70s shag carpet theme going on out here. And that is nori, which we'll discuss momentarily, that volunteers on the bag. These are actually native oysters that we're out looking at. I have a cool Oli project that I'm going to unpack a little bit for you in a minute. Some of you know about it. These are a couple of my guys. You can tell it's me because I'm left-handed. And so one of the things that I love about what I get to do is we're trying to understand how we can do more things with the same space, the same stuff, right? And so the owners had noticed for years that macroalgae recruit. They're like a fouling organism on the gear. And when they approached the regulators, there was really no pathway for harvesting that macroalgae. We could take the baskets in and power wash it off as part of gear maintenance, but we couldn't do anything with it. So a couple of years ago, I was able to modify our permit. It wasn't a big deal. And now we can harvest these macroalgae that recruit to the gear, and we consider a secondary harvest, really. That's nori, and it looks kind of shaggy, but when you harvest it properly, clean it up, dry it properly, it's a lovely product and a highly valued product. So, of course, because we have restaurants, we can make you eat this stuff. You know, our culinary director said, I'm gonna make miso nori butter. And so we now have, you can get grilled oysters with miso nori butter from nori from the farm. And of course, there's Alda everywhere, and there's lots of other things we can talk about. But one of the things that has been a convergence for me, and this is just another illustration of that, is, you know, how can we think more in that circular economy sense, where it's like, you know, we're there to grow oysters, but what if we were also there to harvest seaweeds that co-occur with those oysters? What if we harvested some of those macroalgae and delivered them to BML as feed for abalone? You know, because we have a macrocystis patch. So just wanted to show you that. So let's go shopping, right? Anybody know why we're here? IKEA. It wouldn't be Swedish meatballs, right? So this is to get your attention and to remind me that I'm changing themes here. So right here, Emeryville, right? Who can tell me the name of the street runs in front of IKEA? Shellmound. Shellmound, that's right. Because In the 1920s, prior to the 1920s, there was a giant shell mound. That's it. IKEA sits where that shell mound is today. And it was raised in about 1924, I think, something like that, for warehousing. And today it is now the location that we call IKEA. And if you've ever gone looking for the Shell Mound Park, anybody been to the Shell Mound Park? Yeah, it's about this little corner. It's a wink. But this really, I got introduced to native oysters with Jill, started learning about them. Several people in this community have contributed to that research. Got to know Ted, another one of my haircut buddies. His is long compared to mine, actually. And so this is an artist rendering from the American Museum of Natural History of another shell mound in the Bay Area. And I was fascinated with these because I started finding outcrops of shell mounds around Tomales Bay, just kind of here and there. There's actually, as many of you know, there's some formal sites in the park and at Tom's Point that Tim Schneider's been working on from UC Santa Cruz. But this whole idea that these foods have been nourishing people for a long time. In the park, there's C14 dates that go back about 6,000 years. So we know that these shellfish, have been part of the food system for a really, really long time. I had never considered that until I sort of stumbled into this stuff. Again, accidental learning. And so here's a shucking house from Willapa Bay, right? And people look at those oysters when I show this slide and they're like, how? How can they be that big? But in 1909, I want to assure you, because I nerded out on the old data, there were no other oysters in Willapa Bay except wild native oysters. And they were shucking them by the hundreds of thousands. And so over time, what happens when you apply commercial pressure to a wild resource for a huge and growing population in places like the San Francisco Bay Area, you tap out that resource pretty quickly. And so one of the things that I've gotten to be involved with really in concert and under the mentorship of people around here is some work with native oysters. And I just want to show a few slides that illustrate that, because for me, it's a really sort of special intersection with the work that people here do, right? So when you walk around Tomales Bay today, you'll still see some wild ollies, right? They're kind of clinging to the rocks and I think, clinging on for survival. But we're not seeing ollies, anywhere near this kind of abundance or size, certainly. And interestingly, you may notice there's some drill holes. Oyster. Drills haven't helped, right? And so this is a question that I've gotten pretty involved with in various capacities. And of course, there's some amazing examples of aquaculture with the assist right here with the White Abalone Project. But I always, because I've learned so much from Kirstine Wasson down at Elkhorn Slough, but they're doing oyster restoration in an artisanal way with beautiful shells and steaks. No, I'm glad you told me that. So one of the questions that's been out there is in an estuary like Tomales Bay, where there's plenty of habitat, but there's not really very many animals there. What's the problem? And of course, Ted and his students have worked on this for a long time. But I think we represented one of the first opportunities as a business to kind of get into the mix and work with Carl and Joe and so test the idea. If we farm native oysters, not in artisanal densities, but in commercial densities, would that nudge the ecosystem up so that we'd get larval overflow and we'd get recruitment? Because Tomales Bay has been super recruitment limited for quite a while. Not always, but quite a while. So there's Joe, there's Carl, there's Danielle, who worked for us in the beginning. And today, thanks to work again with Carl and Joe, Hog Island's been involved with, and some of it's been through grant-funded work with the Nature Conservancy, the production of close to 800,000, getting close to 1 million animals We're setting them primarily as seed because my interest is in bringing this food back into California foodways, right? There's still some up in Washington, but generally most people in California have no idea what a native oyster might be. And so I'm interested in that. But we're working with a lot of them at small scale, but still at production scale. And there's Ted. So hi, Ted. Ted, are you out there? So Ted and Shayla, variously over the last few years, have been putting recruitment plates out. So this is another collaboration. Are we seeing a recruitment pulse as a result of all these aquacultured animals out in the bay? Interestingly, this year we saw a pretty measurable recruitment pulse. Of course, we don't know for sure, but given how few adult animals there are in the wild, we think that there's a good chance that there might be a relationship. So that's been super cool. Of course, like I said, I'm interested in the foodway part of this question too, right? Like, what if we farmed native oysters a little more than we do and brought those back to menus? There's some big problems because, whoopsie, that little dude there, that's a 3-year-old animal, and it's the size of a 50-cent piece. So a little tricky in the market to sell that for $5 a pop, or 3 or 4 even. But at any rate, I wanted to just kind of give a nod to that because the Olympia work, it continues. This is part of our farm where we grow them. This is something that Carl and I are working on right now with the Nature Conservancy. Settling native oysters on natural substrates. These are rocks collected lovingly from Tomales Bay along with shells. And of course, when you find them in the wild, they're settled onto rocks. And TNC is interested in doing some experiments with natural outplants. And of course, the ones that settle as singles, I get to put on the farm. So I got a couple of take-home messages. Did you see that? Yeah, that's good. And they will sound light, but they're really meant to be serious. And you know, if I cry or laugh, you'll be there with me. So first, things change, people, right? They change when you're a student. They change while you're doing your research. They change with your hair. And my kid's into reptiles. I never thought I'd be into reptiles. So that's from a few weeks ago. Western pond turtle, you know, pretty cool. And I think that's important for us all to kind of be easy with ourselves. Sometimes we get a little locked in, but things change, right? Our interests change. Look, I mean, in my life, my interests have changed, and I've been fortunate that I could actually find ways to manifest those new interests. But I think it's a simple but important message. It's okay for things to change. It's okay. In fact, I asked some of you today, who really thinks they're going to take that advanced degree and go into academia and is positive right now that that's what they're going to do? Most of you weren't positive, right? And it's okay, right, to build that in. Second take-home message, food from the sea matters. I didn't know that when I started, but I really think it's super important. And those are mussels. And of course, as much as I talk about oysters, mussels are the mind-blowing bivalve in terms of global food systems, right? You grow them in the open ocean. They're eating phytoplankton. They grow literally like weeds. And worldwide, I looked up the statistic, but the potential for mussel aquaculture to improve global protein supplies is sort of super huge right now. We're fiddling around with it a little bit. So finally, this is my biggest take-home message. Curiosity matters, right? You know, sometimes people are like, hey, that's my kid at I don't know, 8 maybe, and that was him last week at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, where they have the new deep sea exhibit, you know, where you kind of, that's not a real fish, people, by the way. Just so if anybody was concerned about that, yeah. But I love that picture, right? Because he's in that interesting space where he's still super curious about everything. And in a real serious way, you know, before science is about data and publications, it's about curiosity, right? It's about wonder. And I think that sometimes we got to go back to that reason that we all ended up here. It's like typically because we loved something out there, right? Something small or something big, and stay connected to that, because I think I'm discovering that the key to mental health as an old bald guy, actually, is to stay curious and stay a learner and take that learner's perspective into things. And I think that's actually the fundamental quality of what we all kind of do and share. And that's it with 10 for questions. You know, my kid did a pretty good job. He put the slides in a reasonable order for me. Okay. Yeah. But some of you, I know we had conversations we were going to continue.
Oh, Ted has confirmed that he is indeed out, by the way.
Oh, hi, Ted. Yeah, sorry. I'm sorry.
All right, we have time for some questions. I'll pass this thing around, which always confuses me, and there's 40 people on Zoom right now, so I'll try to answer a couple.
40?
40, yeah, you're popular today. Any questions out there?
Please.
Okay, guys.
Thanks, Gary. I know you mentioned that you guys are using nori for the nori butter and stuff like
Yeah.
that. Have you started looking at applications for the ulva? I know some people are doing projects for fertilizer stuff.
You bet. Yeah, it's a great question. I'm hoping people will seed me with stuff, because obviously that was a super light sweep. So so ulva is really a more significant fouling organism on many aquaculture operations, and especially on clam farms up in Washington. So USDA just pitched a pretty large $4 million grant to UW and the Puget Sound Restoration Fund. And of course, I think it's all in the title, man. It's all about the title. It's called Blue Carbon to Green Pastures or something like that. Great title. But they're going to be looking over the next few years at really what that looks like to remove ulva in particular and work it into soil amendments, and then look at what that does to the soil chemistry. And so the really interesting report, and again, I'm easy to get. TNC partnered with Bain to do this kind of global look at what it would take to stimulate more seaweed aquaculture in the world. And would it be carbon credits or would it be food systems? And what they determined was a short list of things, one of which was biostimulants and agricultural amendments, but value-added agricultural amendments. And so what we've been considering, so seaweeds are culinary seaweeds are a high-value, low-volume proposition, right? And just recruiting on our gear, we have tons, thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds of macroalgae every year. Most of that's going to come in on the baskets and get washed off unless we do something else. So I'm just now kind of, so we have a sea grant project that Christy Croker is leading at UC Santa Cruz to, with some great folks, Kathy Ann Miller's on the team, to look at what's happening with macroalgae on our aquaculture gear. We have sites in Humboldt, Tomales, and Morrow. Who's there? What are they doing there? And then what might be some of those secondary market applications? The thing that I'm super interested in, besides the food stuff, is essentially creating what I would call an aquaculture residue supplement, right? So we put shells in our gardens. We put fish meal in our gardens. There's seaweeds can go in the gardens. We generate all that as waste, byproducts. What if we could, without too much fuss, create a flexible recipe that allowed us to generate some kind of a oil supplement? We could sell that, but also tell that story. So lots of stuff going on in the space. Those are a couple of things, and happy to follow up with you. Yeah.
No, you can. Well, actually, not across technology.
Thanks for not throwing it at me. That's why I hate the.
Is that a throwing thing?
Yeah, it's throwable. It's terrifying. Thank you so much for this talk. It was amazing. And what you were talking about at the end of your answer to the previous question actually is a great lead into my question. So there's been a lot of talk about using shell waste as a way to alkalinize water to take up more carbon dioxide. You all thought about this, have looked
Yeah.
into it.
So the short and truthful answer, which is the one we should always give, right, is no. I mean, I'm aware of that conversation. Interestingly, the whole issue around shells and what happens to shells is a little tricky because even though oysters are grown in abundance on an oyster farm, they're not sold there, they're not consumed there. So they tend to become waste shells in a very dispersed manner, restaurants, homes, whatever, and how to recollect them into some useful quantity is logistically really problematic. On the East Coast in cities like New York City, where the shells of food oysters are the same species as what's in the wild, there's a lot easier pathway to repurposing them into restoration projects as substrates. In California and in most of the world, people are farming a non-native species, the Pacific oyster. And there are very intentional curing and drying protocols before they can be deployed on restoration sites. So writ large, what we do with shells is a little problematic on the West Coast. We're the biggest shellfish trafficker, is that the right word? On the West, in California. And our shell pile is still not that big of a deal, right? It's nothing like, shell mountains for thousands of years. But super interesting. I think what I can say is we're interested in all that stuff. One of the things I really admire about John and Terry's vision for the next 40 years is I think they really want to see the company use its position to catalyze things in the blue food space, whatever they may be, and as long as we can do that without breaking the bank. And interesting question. Yeah. Are you gonna huck that thing at me?
No,
Oh, good.
definitely not.
I'm not afraid of getting hit. I'm afraid of the embarrassment of not catching it. Yeah.
There's a few Zoom questions. We're not going to be able to get to them all. Apologies. But the first one was from Ted, actually, who you might have to have words with after this.
Gosh, man.
And he said, question, speaking of change, what do you think will be the biggest impact of climate change on restoration aquaculture of the world?
Oh, goodness, Ted. You're either patronizing me like I'm one of your students, or no. I love Ted. I've really enjoyed my time with him. So he probably has a better idea of that than I do. But I think there's a lot of question marks, right? Any of you, I don't know who's worked with native oysters or is working with them, but some of the work that Jill was doing, that Annalise Hettinger was doing, we know that calcifying organisms are facing some pretty big challenges with regard to ocean acidification, in particular hypoxia. But in terms of like the restoration aquaculture or the restorative aquaculture bit, I don't know. I mean, Ted, why didn't you and your grad students figure out why Olympias aren't thriving in Tomales Bay? It's a hard question, and I think what's more interesting to me is that we're drilling in on trying to answer some of those questions. And of course, the big game changer, anybody in this room that's anywhere close to my chapter of life, genetics, like that was a big word for me in grad school, and genomics, like that's almost off the charts. But the tools that are being aimed at some of these questions now are really fascinating. In our Olympia oyster team, there's a lot of work being done by Kevin Johnson down at Cal Poly and with Sea Grant, looking at, for example, we don't really know for sure how different ollies are from one estuary to another in terms of local phenotypes and stuff. Yeah.
Thanks, Gary, for a great talk. So kind of building off what you were just talking about, I was intrigued by that photo showing from 1909 these really big Olympia oysters, and it seems like from the standpoint of making Olympia oysters a viable aquaculture project, it would be great if they were still that big. And so do you have any thoughts on why they aren't that big? Have you ever seen an Olympia oyster get that big, and what's going on there?
So I love that question, and I've leaned into my friends and colleagues up at the Puget Sound Restoration Fund who've done a lot of Olympia restoration work. There is a sense that Willapa grew them big. I mean, just even as wild animals, whatever was going on there, they were big. What we've observed, and this is strictly anecdotally, and from a guy who's in a, Oklahoma, is that when we settle them on culch, on shells, and they compete for space, and there are winners and losers, you end up with a shell that has a lower density of animals, but they get bigger, right? When we grow them in baskets and they're all, even if we have pretty low densities, they're still kind of packed in there and they're growing against each other. And we pretty categorically see them in aquaculture baskets grow smaller. I mean, they just don't get very big. Some of the ones that I've found around Tomales Bay in the wild are, are the size of those. And of course, we have to assume that they were high grading the biggest animals that were available to them when they were harvesting them. So I think, in truth, Eric, I think we just are getting better at upselling a very small oyster. Because the grow out to anything larger than a quarter for us, and of course there's no money in them. We should be clear about that. Anything that has a grow out of 3 to 4 years is very difficult to pencil. So it's a labor of love, but it's one we can put our arms around a little bit.
For those that aren't aware, it's 4 p.m. If you have any meetings or whatever, I'm going to take the liberty of saying that people are still interested. So I'll take one more question for the audience and one question from Zoom, if that's okay. I'll do the Zoom question first. Someone raise their hand for this. Are there any efforts to explore non-plastic gear in aquaculture?
Yes. Obviously, plastics in all kinds of marine work is a challenge, right? So I just opened a box from Spain yesterday with some cellulose-based aquaculture netting that we're going to demo and trial. But it's an important question, and I think in terms of containing sharp-edged animals in a structure that lasts more, that's not a single-use structure, it's tough. I think most of the research, of course, much of that material's not produced domestically. Like a lot of our gear comes from Australia. I don't know where it's actually manufactured, but the efforts to create a plastic material that is more resilient to shedding microplastics. But no, it's a good question, and one that we think about. But from our perch, we're not in the gear manufacturing business, so we kind of keep our eyes on what other things are doing. I will say the guy from Spain that I met at the conference in San Antonio earlier this year said, we developed this product because shellfish farms in the EU really wanted an alternative. These are the bags for selling them in, Good question. No good answer on that one.
Any more questions in the audience? If not, I have. Okay. I have interacted with a lot of aquaculture producers, companies in different sectors largely, and I haven't met one before that's so willing to. I mean, there's obviously pros and cons for a company like Hog Island to engage in conservation efforts and research efforts, and it comes at a cost. How, and ultimately, I bet it comes down to vision. So, like, what is the reason that Hog Island engages in things? How do you incentivize other companies to do that as well? Gotta
take that pause when I invoke that. No, I think if we start with Hog Island, why is Hog Island in this space? Colleen understands this. I really think it goes back to the vision and values of the guys that started and run the company. And I think that goes back to their backgrounds as marine scientists. They got undergraduate degrees in marine bio, and they see the work that I believe. I'm their storyteller now. I believe that they see the work they do through that lens that they developed years and years ago of the marine space as an ecosystem with a basic understanding of ecological processes. And I think they've understood their work in that way. That said, I'm finding that a lot of people in the aquaculture space actually have some of that similar background. George Trevelyan is a PhD from right here. He owns an oyster farm down in Morro Bay, Grassy Bar. And I think, so whether or not we need to project that interest out, we may not need to do that, right? Because here's the thing that I think is kind of at the root of that. If you want to grow food in the ocean and you're growing filter feeders or photosynthesizers that are food grade, the ecosystem around them has to be pretty healthy, right? Rowan Jacobson has this great quote, that oysters are like the canary in the coal mine, right? If you can eat oysters from an estuary, that estuary is probably in pretty good shape in terms of overall ecosystem health. I think that modern era, if you want to participate in unfed aquaculture, nearshore aquaculture, you kind of have to be an ecologist. You have to build your business around an ecological framework. You are intersecting with physical and biological processes that you really are not allowed to or couldn't control if you wanted to. I tell people all the time, there's no knobs on the ocean. That's why we have a hatchery, because we got some knobs there to deal with the temperature and the pH and stuff like that. And so I think that in a way, the aquaculture of today and the future, especially of the future, we were talking about this earlier, is really going to require a de facto ecology education and perspective to do. Many of the questions in terms of where we're headed, right now, oyster farmers just want their animals to not die, right? We were talking about this. There's a 40% mortality rate in farmed oysters in Tomales Bay. We don't really even know why, right? In Humboldt Bay, 5%, right? Those are things that are happening with underlying PhDs and master's theses. Bring them on down and help unpack those problems. So I think that we're not going to have to upsell it. I think John and Terry may be a little bit special in their background. George Trevelyan, same way. But in general, the future is paved with collaborative work with research, and everybody can see that. When I go to conferences, people are paying attention to these things. I think it's a great question. I think that's more or less the right answer.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Gary. Gary is able to share a few minutes of his time afterwards for Wind Down Wednesday. We'll probably start it earlier than usual so we can let Gary leave by 5. But thank you so much, everyone, for joining, and let's give Gary one last round of applause.
Thank you all. It's been super fun. This is not the one I usually get to give.